as is my custom every week, I spend a fair bit of time praying, thinking, reading, studying, and trying to make it seem like I know what I'm doing when I come to this moment of giving the homily. And as the week progressed, one good idea came after another, and I found that nothing seemed to work. Because I could have talked to you at great length about how do you go about living life loving God? What does that look like? What are the pitfalls? What are the sins to avoid? How do you do this? What does it look like when you live loving God, etc., etc.? I could have told you all of that. But then a voice, something like a voice, I'm not hearing things. Last night, I thought, has anyone ever taught you how to love God? We know a lot about living according to God's law. But did anyone teach you how? So today, we're going to have a little bit of a teaching homily. So if you want to take out pens and paper or your phone and take notes, you are welcome to do that, because I want to give you a very basic bit of education on how do you learn to love God. What does that look like? What do you have to do concretely? We heard, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, your mind, and with all your strength. Here's how you do that. If you're going to love the Lord your God with all your heart, you have to pray. We know prayer is important. You, like I, probably grew up praying with the rosary and Hail Marys and novenas and prayer books of all kinds of wonderful prayers to saints. But I'm not talking about that now. I'm talking about something deeper, something more profound. The prayer where you learn to sit deeply, heart to heart, open, vulnerable, and in love with God. And the best place to begin is right here. This is the technique I teach to everyone. Megan, what does that say? 3 minutes. You set your phone for 3 minutes. I'm not going to do it because it's going to beep long before my homily's over. You set your phone to 3 minutes. You put it face down. Don't look at it. Don't think about the time. You say a very simple prayer giving God permission to be totally present. Giving God permission to be in that space with you. And then for 3 minutes, you try to open your heart in silence. Because we know in our lives, in every relationship which we have, whether it's relationships with our parents, with significant others, with friends, even our pets, we know that so much requires activity, engagement, and busyness, or some sort of interaction. But that relationship with God is very different. It requires us to learn how to be present to God in silence. The fancy name for this type of prayer is contemplative prayer. Just 3 minutes. If you're doing it right, it will be frightening and it will feel like a lifetime. And then in a couple weeks, if you're so inclined, we're talking 3 minutes a day, you can go to 4 minutes. In a couple years, maybe 5 or 7 minutes. But the practice of daily, 3 minutes of silence, just 3 minutes of being present and totally open to God, learning to feel the presence of God in that moment of silence, that is the deepest form of prayer. That is the prayer of the mystics and the saints. That is contemplative prayer. That is the way to learn how to love God with our heart. Now, how do we love God with our soul and with our mind? Right here. You have to know what's in here. You've got to know these incredible stories in Scripture. And the place that I recommend you begin is not on page 1. Don't begin with Genesis chapter 1. It's a great story. Don't start there. Rather, kind of go to the end. So here we are. And you see the difference between the thickness? This is the Old Testament. This is the New Testament. Start with the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1. In the New Testament, there are 4 Gospels. Gospels are mini biographies of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then we've got a little book called the Acts of the Apostles, and what that is, it's basically the first 25-year history of the church. And then you've got the epistles, which is a Greek word for letters. And so these are letters from St. Paul, St. Peter, St. James, St. John, St. Jude. These are letters that the bishops of the church were writing to people to help them understand their faith better and live their faith better. And the wisdom in those letters are incredible. If you want to learn to love God with all your mind, you've got to know these stories. And please, when you read this, 2 chapters a day. Just 2 chapters a day. Don't read it as a textbook. This isn't homework. Don't read it like a Wikipedia page looking for information or citations. Read the story. Get to know the compassion of Jesus. Get to know his humility. See how he points out the power and the hypocrisy of his day and how he confronts all of the self-righteousness, how he is so kind to sinners, compassionate to those on the margins of life. See how much he loves. Understand who he really is. If you want to love God with your mind, you have to know what's in here. The good news is, if you come to my office, we have a couple of cases of Bibles. Cases. If you want a Bible, I'll give you one for free. I want you to read this. If you have a friend who's not here, I'll give them 2. And finally, if we want to love God with all of our strength, we have to do something that's difficult. If you want to know who God is, you have to see the face of Jesus in the poor. If you want to love God with all your strength, you have to get outside your comfort zone. You have to go and encounter those who are poor and marginalized in this world. You have to see them face to face. Look in the eyes of Christ. And it's hard. This is why it requires all your strength. You must let your lives be open and vulnerable to them, to hear their suffering, to hear their pain, to see the compassion that Christ shows them. This is how we love with all of our strength. You must get to know the poor in spirit, the marginalized, the unwanted, the judged, the condemned, the belittled. You have to know the forgotten and unwanted of this world, because it's only in them that you see the living face of Christ on earth today. This is how we learn to love Jesus with all our strength. Because if you haven't done it before, it takes a lot of strength to do it. But here's the good news. You've already got a timer on your phone. You've got a free Bible waiting for you in my office. Tomorrow, we're taking a group of students to a soup kitchen in town to serve the poor. If you feel moved and you want to try to love God with all your strength immediately, this is the time to do it. Right now, online, applications are open for our spring break service trips to serve the poor. We're going to the coast of Carolina to help with the poor rebuilding after the hurricane, and we're taking a trip to work at an orphanage of unwanted and disabled children in Jamaica. If you want to learn to serve Jesus, to love Jesus with all your strength, I invite you to consider volunteering for one of those opportunities. This is how we learn to love God. Like any relationship, it requires effort. Like any relationship, we have to be deliberate about it. But like God, our job is to open our lives up. It's not easy, which is why so few do it. If you want to learn how to love God with your heart, pray. If you long to love him with your mind and soul, read. And if you want to learn how to love him with all your strength, serve the poor. This is how we learn not only to love God, but to love our neighbor as ourselves.